Capcom faced a challenge. The original Resident Evil defined survival horror in 1996, but it ran the risk of becoming samey with a fourth game.
Hasta luego.
Deviate too far from the formula though, and they might unbalance the elements that made Resi great. It was on this knife edge that Capcom carved Resident Evil 4, and many of its design approaches became industry standards. Here's how it revolutionized the survival horror genre.
Well now, time to cause some mayhem!
Survival horror had historically leaned heavily on psychological dread.
Cheryl? Is that Cheryl?
Characters wouldn't know if their nightmares were just hallucinations, while narrow, constrictive environments peppered with tense scares defined the genre. Resident Evil 4 added more schlock to the shock. The gameplay complexity ramped up. Players had to juggle more enemies, resources, and strategies to survive, relying on both firepower and wits. It was both an action and a horror game, which in the coming years would inspire more developers to combine genres. Say, a first-person shooter meshed with an RPG.
Wait a minute, he's still breathing.
BioShock's lead level designer Bill Gardner said in an interview with Den of Geek, "Resident Evil very much gave me the confidence to say, players can handle it. In fact, they're hungry for it." More complex gameplay made the static cameras of previous Resi installments unworkable. Resident Evil 4 needed a camera that could keep pace with Leon and not disorient the player. Early in development, the team experimented with a dynamic camera, and you can actually see the idea in Devil May Cry, which started life as the intended prototype of a new Resident Evil game, but became a whole new franchise when Capcom realised that the stylish, juggling action strayed too far from the series' roots. If Resident Evil 4 had continued down that route, a series of dynamic cameras would have been carefully positioned around levels, with the player seamlessly cutting between each as they moved. Capcom even showed an early build of the game at E3 in 2003 that showed this hybrid dynamic camera in action. Later in development, the Resi 4 camera was reimagined again. It would hover over Leon's shoulder, tracking his movements and placing the player in the action. This third-person camera set the blueprint for the kind of precision aiming that became industry standard in all action shooter games thereafter. Resi 4 still retained the rooted controls of previous games while shooting, but with a third-person perspective, players were encouraged to be more methodical in their aim. They could be precise with different results depending on whether they shot a leg or a head. One of the systems that Resident Evil 4 didn't shout about on launch was its dynamic difficulty. Die too many times and the game would quietly adjust its AI to make enemies less quick to attack, or even just remove enemies from upcoming encounters altogether. The system was carefully calculated to make sure players were challenged just enough to be tense, but never felt frustrated. These kinds of dynamic difficulty systems had existed before in games, but Resident Evil made a point of never mentioning it, in case players felt patronised or hard done by. It kept players focused on the task at hand, and in that hard-to-achieve state of flow.
Long time no see.
Resident Evil 4 was a landmark installment in the series, adding more than a few genre-defining features. You can re-experience them yourself when the remake launches on 24th of March on PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, Xbox Series X and S, and PC. For everything from the return to Salazar Castle, keep it locked to IGN.